He thought it was just a simple walk. But he'll regret leaving. What started as a normal day turned into a chilling mystery when objects belonging to the missing children began appearing. Small toys, backpacks, even a smartphone left behind in the shadows. One by one, the clues paint a picture no one could have predicted. Police have already discovered several leads, combing through the area with painstaking detail, but each new finding raises more questions than answers. Will these fragments of the truth be enough to uncover what really happened, or is there something far more sinister hiding in plain sight? The summer air in the Sierra Nevada town of Mammoth Lakes was thin, crisp, and tinged with the smell of chlorine from the outdoor pool of the Mountain Pines Lodge, a mid-range hotel that had become a hub for traveling families exploring the trails and lakes of eastern California. And on that afternoon it was crowded with children splashing, parents half watching from loungers, waiters weaving through with drinks and towels. But two children in particular. A boy of 9 named Ethan and his 7-year-old sister Lily had been swimming in the shallow end for hours while their parents lingered at the patio bar, laughing with friends from out of town, and it seemed harmless enough at first, the kind of summer memory any family would expect to take home with them, except that when the time came for lunch and the parents wandered over to call them, the pool was strangely empty, their inflatables drifting lazily without anyone on them, the lifeguard distracted at the far end, and there was no trace of either child. Panic surged in the father's voice as he shouted their names. Other parents turned to look, but no one had seen them leave the water, no one had noticed them climbing out, and in that instant the entire atmosphere of the hotel shifted from casual leisure to taut alarm, with staff rushing to check restrooms, the parking lot, the corridors of the lobby, and the surrounding grounds while the mother stood frozen, clutching the wet towel her daughter had used only minutes earlier, unable to comprehend how two children could vanish from a crowded pool without a single witness, and within the hour local police were called, their sirens echoing against the granite peaks, their radios crackling with orders as deputies spread out, combing the forested slopes and roadside pullouts, searching dumpsters and maintenance rooms. But nothing surfaced except an abandoned pair of goggles and a half-empty juice box near a bench, items too ordinary to explain anything. As daylight faded, the lodge was transformed into a staging ground, search dogs brought in, helicopters sweeping the ridgeline with floodlights, and rumors spread among the guests, some insisting they had heard children laughing near the service road, others swearing they had seen a white pickup truck parked briefly by the back fence, though cameras at the entrance showed nothing conclusive, only a blur of headlights and shadows. Interviews began with staff and tourists, long and exhausting, as the parents oscillated between rage and despair, clinging to the hope that their children had simply wandered off, though by midnight deputies admitted that the wilderness surrounding Mammoth could swallow hikers for days, and every hour without a sighting reduced the odds of a safe return. Yet what puzzled investigators most was the sheer suddenness. The pool had been crowded, the area monitored, and still no one could place the moment Ethan and Lily left the water. No footprints on the wet concrete, no dripping trail into the lobby, nothing except absence itself. By morning news crews arrived, broadcasting live shots of deputies fanning out into the forests, volunteers in neon vests beating through brush, rangers scaling rocky gullies, and still the silence stretched, heavy and merciless, while the mother collapsed in a chair clutching a teddy bear that had been left in their hotel room, whispering that her children would never have run off willingly. Investigators began pressing harder, checking guest lists for anyone who had checked out abruptly, tracing phone signals from the area, and one deputy suggested the possibility of an organized abduction, though no ransom demands came and no clear suspects emerged. Only whispers of something unseen beneath the normal surface of the lodge. The first week passed in a haze of futile searches, theories multiplying, tensions growing, and then came the clue that reframed everything. When detectives examined security logs from a side entrance, they found that the door had been opened at precisely the same time the children vanished, yet the camera trained on that hallway had inexplicably cut out for 12 minutes before returning, and in that gap, the only trace was a faint reflection in the glass of a figure leading two small shapes toward the parking area, their outlines blurred but unmistakable, raising the most chilling question of all. How could someone have orchestrated such a disappearance in broad daylight, unnoticed by dozens of people? And what secret trail had carried Ethan and Lily away from the heart of the Sierra Nevada, leaving behind nothing but wet towels, drifting pool toys, and the silence of a family's shattered summer? Under the heavy shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the second week after the disappearance of Ethan and Lily pressed down like a weight no one in Mammoth Lakes could ignore, and while the initial shock had already sent tremors through the lodge, the wider town, and even the state news outlets, It was in the second stage of the case that the entire story transformed from a missing persons alert into something more complex, frightening, and shrouded in unanswered questions. Every day began with search parties heading into the forests at dawn, boots crunching on frosted pine needles, dogs pulling against their leashes, deputies hauling ropes and maps, but each night ended with nothing but silence, the parents returning to their hotel room where the untouched beds of their children remained like shrines, the mother staring at the ceiling as if sheer will could summon them back, while the father roamed the lobby with red-rimmed eyes demanding answers from detectives who themselves felt trapped in a puzzle too large to assemble, for no ransom calls came, no suspicious strangers lingered in town, and the only concrete anomaly remained that camera glitch, 12 minutes of blindness in which two small silhouettes had been guided into the night. It should have been impossible to vanish so cleanly from a crowded pool, and that impossibility was what fed the rumors that spread through Mammoth. Guests whispering in corridors that perhaps the children had been taken by someone they knew, perhaps a worker at the lodge, or even, as one older tourist muttered, someone tied to trafficking routes that passed through the state, and though the sheriff dismissed the wilder speculation, he could not ignore the pressure mounting from state investigators who now joined the case, flooding the area with resources, drones mapping ridgelines, forensic teams combing over laundry rooms, maintenance closets, and air vents, even draining a section of the pool itself to ensure nothing had been overlooked, yet every lead crumbled, every trace dissolved, until one volunteer brought in a curious discovery from a trail 3 miles out. A child's flip-flop, mud-streaked, roughly the size Lily would wear, but when shown to the mother she shook her head and whispered it was the wrong brand, and still the detectives tagged it, bagged it, sent it to the lab, only to receive no DNA match. Meanwhile, the parents turned increasingly against one another, the mother accusing the father of drinking at the bar what he should have been watching, the father snapping that she had left them too long, and in the cracks of their grief the detectives saw the raw cost of the case, a family unraveling while the children remained unseen. But it was not only family tension that marked the second phase, it was the strange trail of half-leads, a reported sighting of 2 children walking with a man in Bishop, 100 miles south, disproven when the children turned out to be locals. A call from Reno about a woman claiming she had overheard strangers discussing the pool kids, which fizzled when the woman admitted she had been drunk. A driver who insisted he had nearly hit 2 barefoot children on a side road near Yosemite, only for rangers to sweep the entire canyon and find nothing. Each false lead left the parents more hollow, more doubtful of survival, and yet detectives could not abandon the possibility that someone had meticulously planned the abduction, exploiting that exact window of distraction at the pool. In interviews with lodge staff, one maintenance worker mentioned seeing a white truck parked near the service entrance days before, its driver loitering longer than usual, and though he hadn't thought much of it then, when pressed he admitted the man wore a ball cap low, sunglasses despite the dusk, and seemed to avoid eye contact, but of course the plates had not been written down, and the lodge cameras aimed that direction were either broken or missing. Footage, adding to the eerie sense that someone had tampered deliberately with surveillance. When the FBI became involved by the 3rd week, their agents re-interviewed every witness, studied the hotel security systems, and concluded that while equipment failure was possible, the coincidence of a 12-minute blackout at the exact moment 2 children vanished could not be brushed aside, leading to the working theory that someone with inside knowledge had engineered the event, perhaps bribing or coercing staff, yet still the central question persisted. Why no contact, no demand, no claim of responsibility? During this period the emotional spikes that gripped the case became part of national attention. Television shows broadcasting the parents' trembling pleas, neighbors from their hometown holding candlelight vigils, strangers donating money to fund the search, but behind the headlines, detectives quietly worried about something darker. For children who disappeared and remained uncontacted by abductors often ended up trafficked across borders or worse, and the race against time became a silent drumbeat in every strategy meeting. Still, even with that fear gnawing, there were moments of fragile hope. In the 4th week, hikers in the Inyo forest stumbled on a child's plastic bracelet tangled in undergrowth, pink with faded letters spelling Lily, and though the parents' hearts leapt when it was presented, analysis showed the bracelet carried no fingerprints, no sweat residue, as if it had been washed clean or placed there intentionally, and that detail shook the lead detective more than anything else, because if it was planted, then someone was toying with the investigation, manipulating not only evidence but emotion itself. The parents broke again that night, the mother collapsing on live television, her sobs echoing through households across America, and the father clutching her shoulders with the hollow look of a man barely containing rage. And in that Raw display, the case became no longer just about two children but about a symbol of innocence stolen, an event that seemed to prove how fragile even the most ordinary family vacation could be. Yet still the mountains yielded no trace, the forests gave no whisper, the hotels around the region showed no suspicious check-ins, and the roadblocks turned up nothing. Until finally the investigators faced the grim necessity of widening the search beyond California itself, sending alerts across Nevada, Oregon, Arizona, and beyond. And in that widening circle the terrifying possibility emerged. If Ethan and Lily had been transported, they could be anywhere by now, alive or not, and all the sheriff could tell the parents as July bled into August was that the trail had not gone cold but had stretched thin, nearly invisible. Then came the second cliffhanger. The revelation that appended assumptions and sent shock through the command center. A call placed by a store clerk in Salt Lake City, who reported that two disheveled children had entered her shop accompanied by an older woman, their clothes ill-fitting, their faces pale, and though she had not thought much of it at first, something about the boys' eyes lingered in her mind. Unfamiliar city, raising. The return of the two missing children should have been the end of the nightmare, the closing of a chapter in a story that had dragged on for months and left scars on everyone involved. But instead it opened a new and even more disturbing chapter, because when the authorities brought them back from the distant city where they were discovered wandering in confusion, nothing about them seemed normal. Nothing matched the innocent laughter and familiar warmth that their parents remembered from the day at the hotel pool, the day when everything had shifted into a long shadow of uncertainty. They were alive, yes, but alive in a way that carried mystery, carrying with them a silence that was heavier than any words could have been, a silence that spoke of things that no child should have seen or endured. And as their parents embraced them with trembling arms, tears streaming down their faces, the children stood stiff and unresponsive, their eyes darting around the room as if searching for something unseen, something absent yet present, as though whatever had taken them had not fully released them even now. Authorities asked questions, doctors examined them, psychologists tried to coax words out of them, but the children gave only fragments, half-sentences, whispered phrases that often contradicted each other, and sometimes they would lapse into a strange shared silence where they seemed to understand one another without speaking, glancing with subtle nods as if agreeing on what could not be said aloud, leaving investigators frustrated and parents haunted by the fear that they might never know the full truth of what had happened. The story of their disappearance and reappearance spread quickly, the media turning it into headlines and sensational speculation, neighbors whispering theories, strangers reaching out with sympathy or judgment, some insisting it had been a kidnapping for ransom gone wrong, others speculating about secret cults, trafficking networks, or even something more supernatural, though the official investigation stubbornly clung to the facts that were incomplete and scattered, a trail of security footage, blurred sightings, and confused witnesses who claimed to have seen two children resembling them in bus stations, roadside diners, or walking with adults who could never later be identified. The strangest element of all was how far they had traveled and how little sense the journey made, because the city where they were found was hundreds of kilometers away, and yet there were no clear signs of how they had gotten there, no consistent record of them boarding trains or buses, no missing persons reports from in-between towns that matched their descriptions, only isolated fragments like shadows on water, fleeting impressions of movement that could not be verified. Their parents, exhausted and desperate for clarity, begged the children to speak, to tell them what had happened, where they had been, who had taken them, but the children seemed locked inside themselves, sometimes clutching each other's hands tightly as if only they could provide comfort, sometimes waking in the middle of the night with screams that filled the house and brought everyone running, but when asked what had frightened them they would say nothing, only stare at the corners of the room with wide, terrified eyes. Months passed and the investigation seemed to stall, until one night the younger child began to draw in secret, sketching shapes on scraps of paper, drawings that at first looked like meaningless scribbles but slowly revealed patterns, houses, roads, figures with blurred faces, and a recurring symbol that appeared again and again, a circle intersected by jagged lines like broken glass, and when shown to investigators, these drawings reignited interest because they seemed to match descriptions of an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city where they had been found, a building that had once been used as a factory but had long since fallen into disrepair, and when police searched the site they found disturbing traces, children's shoes, discarded toys, mattresses on the floor, food containers, and graffiti on the walls that matched the circle and line symbol from the children's sketches. Suddenly the narrative shifted, no longer just a mystery of vanishing, but a possible operation hidden in plain sight, a place where children could have been kept before being moved, and yet the trail was already cold, the factory empty, No signs of recent activity except for what the investigators suspected were deliberate attempts to erase evidence. The parents were crushed by the knowledge that their children might not have been alone, that others could still be out there, lost or hidden, and the guilt of not having watched them closely enough that day at the pool grew heavier, transforming into a relentless obsession to uncover every truth, to demand answers from the authorities, to seek private investigators when official ones grew tired, to interview strangers who claimed to know something but often turned out to be liars or opportunists. The children, slowly, began to speak more, but what they said only deepened the mystery. They remembered being taken not by force but by persuasion, someone telling them to follow, promising them something. What exactly they would not or could not explain. And then they spoke of long corridors, locked doors, and voices they could hear but not see, voices that instructed them to remain quiet, to obey, to wait, and then sudden moves at night when they were loaded into vehicles, shifted from place to place, until finally one day they were simply released, abandoned in the other city as if their usefulness had ended. But when pressed on who had taken them, what faces they had seen, they always faltered, growing silent, trembling, or contradicting each other, as if memories had been tampered with or fear still held them hostage. Psychologists suggested trauma, the mind's defense against unbearable events, but others whispered darker explanations, that perhaps they had been conditioned not to reveal the truth, that perhaps those who had taken them still had invisible chains around their thoughts. As months turned into a year, the family tried to rebuild their lives, yet the shadow never lifted, every laugh tinged with the memory of screams, every normal day haunted by the fragility of their regained safety. And then came the letter, slipped anonymously into their mailbox one morning, containing only a single sheet of paper with the same circle and line symbol and a few words scrawled beneath it. "This is not over." The parents rushed to the police, who treated it as a threat but found no fingerprints, no trace of origin, no camera footage of who had delivered it, and the case that had seemed to be slowly fading into unsolved status suddenly reignited with fear, because it suggested that whoever had been behind the disappearance was still watching, still near, still able to reach them. The children reacted strangely to the letter, staring at the symbol for long moments, their faces pale, as if they remembered something they could not bring themselves to say, and later that night the older child. The letter marked the beginning of a new torment for the family, a reminder that the nightmare had not ended when the children were brought back from that distant city, but had only shifted into another phase, one where shadows stretched into every corner of their lives and every moment was poisoned by suspicion. And though the police promised increased patrols and took fingerprints and examined the handwriting, they could find nothing to tie the note to any suspect, no evidence that could be used to make an arrest or close the circle of fear, and so the family lived under the constant weight of dread, checking locks twice at night, drawing curtains even in daylight, watching strangers on the street with nervous eyes, and worst of all, the children seemed to know more than they were willing or able to share, because each time they caught sight of the strange symbol, whether drawn on the letter or etched in memory, they grew silent and withdrawn, clinging to each other as though the very sight of it summoned invisible chains. The parents debated whether to move away, to abandon their home in the city that had become a prison, but there was nowhere safe if the people behind the disappearance were as resourceful as they feared, and the investigators themselves seemed divided, some insisting it had been a trafficking operation shut down before completion, others whispering of secret groups with motives beyond money, motives that reached into areas the authorities refused to acknowledge openly. And as the weeks turned to months again, the case grew colder on paper even as it burned hotter in the minds of those who lived through it. The older child began to wake at night with strange episodes, walking through the house half asleep, muttering words that made no sense, sometimes drawing that same circle and line symbol in the condensation on windows or on the backs of envelopes left on tables, and when asked later they claimed to remember nothing, only to feel tired and heavy as though something had drained them, while the younger child grew fearful of leaving the house, refusing to attend school, insisting that they were still watching from the playground or from cars parked too long outside, and though the parents tried to reassure them, they too noticed things they could not dismiss, unfamiliar vehicles idling near the street, phone calls where no one spoke but faint static hissed in the background, and moments when the house's electricity flickered for no reason. One day, while sorting through the children's belongings, the mother found a folded scrap of paper hidden inside a toy box, a note written in the child's shaky hand, but the words were not their own. They seemed dictated, repeating a chilling sentence. "We belong to them," followed by the circle symbol drawn with unsteady lines, and when confronted, the children cried and swore they hadn't written it. Yet their trembling hands betrayed some deeper truth, whether it was memory, coercion, or Something lodged in their minds like a splinter. The father grew desperate, reaching out to private investigators who promised answers but delivered only theories, from secret networks operating across borders to psychological conditioning. And though money drained from their savings, nothing brought peace, only more questions and dead ends. The media, which had once devoured the story, turned its attention to other scandals. But occasionally a reporter would return, asking probing questions that left the family uneasy, as though even the journalists knew there was more beneath the surface, something that could not easily be published without consequence. Then came the second letter, this time left under the windshield of the family car in a grocery store parking lot. A note written in the same style but with different words. We are patient. We are near. Do not resist what must be. And though again the police became involved, again there were no leads, no fingerprints, no cameras capturing who had placed it, and the sense of being surrounded by an invisible net only tightened. The older child began to speak in fragments that unsettled everyone. They mentioned names the parents had never heard, places they had never visited, describing corridors with flickering lights and doors that never opened, men with blurred faces speaking in whispers, and a leader who remained unseen but whose presence they felt, commanding silence, obedience, loyalty, and though psychologists attributed it to trauma, the parents felt deep inside that these were not mere dreams or inventions, but fragments of truth leaking through the cracks. One evening, during a storm that rattled the windows and shook the house with thunder, the children both woke screaming, claiming they had heard the same voice whispering their names from outside, and when the father ran into the yard with a flashlight, he found no one, only wet grass and the sound of rain. But in the morning they discovered muddy footprints near the back door, prints too large to belong to the children and too fresh to dismiss as old. The fear turned into a relentless watchfulness, neighbors drawn into quiet discussions, some offering help, others warning the family to leave before it was too late, and yet leaving seemed impossible, as though they were caught in a web that would follow them wherever they went. Eventually the parents decided to take the children to the city where they had been found, hoping to retrace steps, to confront whatever past lingered there, and though the police warned against it, they traveled quietly, keeping their intentions secret, and when they arrived, the children grew restless, pointing to streets they seemed to recognize, pulling their parents toward places that made no sense, until finally they reached the outskirts where the abandoned factory stood, the same one. The authorities had once searched, and the children froze, trembling, refusing to go closer, whispering, "It's still there, it's still waiting." Inside the factory, dust lay thick and the air smelled of rust and mildew, but deeper within the walls bore fresh marks, new graffiti of the same circle symbol, candles melted in corners, and scraps of fabric that suggested someone had been there recently, not months ago but days, perhaps even hours, and as the parents stood in that cold silence, a sound echoed, a soft tapping, like someone knocking far away, and the children clutched their hands, begging to leave. They left, but not before the father picked up a scrap of paper from the floor, a note that seemed to have been left for them. "You should not have come back." That night, in the hotel they had chosen in the city, the children refused to sleep, and the parents, terrified of another disappearance, kept watch by their beds. But as dawn broke, they discovered something chilling. Another note slipped under their door without anyone hearing or seeing, this time saying only, "We will take them again." The parents knew then that the nightmare had only deepened, that the return of their children had never been a true rescue, but merely the beginning of something larger, something that still had its claws in their lives. The journey that had begun with a single horrifying disappearance now unfolded into a labyrinth of fear and suspicion that seemed impossible to escape, as the family realized that every move they made was shadowed by forces they could neither see nor understand. And though the authorities had promised protection, the notes, the footprints, the whispering voices that the children claimed to hear suggested that the people, or whatever entity, responsible for their abduction had far more reach than anyone could have imagined, and even the smallest misstep might invite them back into the lives of the children, threatening to erase months of fragile recovery in an instant. Every time the family tried to establish routines, the sense of being watched made each meal, each bedtime, each moment outside the house feel like a potential trap, a test, and despite the children's physical return, their emotional and mental states revealed wounds that no embrace, no gentle word, no psychologists' reassurance could fully heal, and so the parents resolved to take matters into their own hands, hiring private investigators, cybersecurity experts, and investigators with experience in cases of child abductions and secret networks, attempting to trace the trail that had been left in fragmented pieces, hoping that somewhere in the distant city or along the routes the children had traveled, There might be evidence that could finally reveal the truth. It was during one of these covert searches that a breakthrough occurred. The investigators discovered surveillance footage from a traffic camera on a highway hundreds of kilometers away from the hotel, captured days before the children had been found, showing two small figures walking beside a man whose face was obscured by a hat, the children clutching his hands tightly yet showing no signs of struggle, as if they followed willingly, and though this did not explain the months in between, it provided a starting point, a tangible clue, a face in the void that could be pursued, and when the investigators traced the license plate of a vehicle seen nearby, it led them to a storage warehouse in a different part of the city, an unassuming brick building surrounded by chain-link fencing, where neighbors reported seeing delivery vans come and go at odd hours, yet none of the official searches had ever flagged the location, and the parents, though terrified, insisted on going there with the investigators to confront whatever remained of the operation, to see with their own eyes where their children had spent the weeks and months that had slipped by like a shadow, and what they found inside stunned everyone. The warehouse was empty, stripped of any signs of recent habitation, yet remnants remained. Faded drawings on walls that matched the circle and line symbol, small footprints frozen in dust, and a small, discarded backpack belonging to the younger child, containing nothing but a single crumpled note that said, "They are watching still," and it was clear that someone had been there very recently, leaving a message that could only be intended for the parents, for the children, or for both, and the weight of it crushed them with the realization that the abduction had never been about simple concealment or ransom, but about control, psychological dominance, and a game that no one had agreed to play yet had been thrust upon them. As the investigation intensified, it became apparent that the symbol the children kept drawing, the circle intersected by jagged lines, was not random but a mark of an organization, one with patterns in its movements, a network that seemed to operate without detection, leaving only cryptic signs, whispers, and the occasional trace of clothing or objects, as though daring the family to follow, daring them to understand before it was too late, and though the investigators worked tirelessly, following leads across state lines, contacting informants, analyzing digital communications, every answer only produced more questions, because the organization had covered its tracks with precision, leaving no fingerprints, no digital traces, only fragments of memory in the children and the occasional symbol, and as the parents read the sketches, the notes, and the whispered words, they realized that the children were key, not merely victims, but carriers of information too dangerous for them to comprehend fully, which made the stakes higher than anyone could have imagined. Then came the encounter with a witness, a man who had once been a driver for the group responsible, who agreed to meet in a secluded park late at night, bringing with him pieces of information that were both horrifying and revealing, explaining that the children had been moved through a circuit of safe houses, trained to obey subtle commands, and conditioned to accept silence, fear, and unpredictability as normal. And though he spoke in hushed tones, terrified of being followed, his words illuminated the mechanics of the operation, the routes they had taken, and the people involved, including one figure described only as the leader, a shadowy presence who orchestrated everything, someone whose reach could stretch far and whose motives were rooted in control rather than profit. And as the parents listened, they realized that months of searching, months of sleepless nights, had brought them to the brink of a dangerous confrontation, because uncovering the truth also meant stepping directly into the crosshairs of those who had engineered the abduction. When the family returned to their temporary residence, the children were restless, aware of the discussion, and that night they woke screaming again, pointing at the windows and walls as if the shadows themselves were moving, whispering threats only they could hear, and though the parents tried to comfort them, they felt the tangible presence of a menace just beyond the threshold, a menace that had waited patiently for this moment, that had orchestrated months of absence and trauma with meticulous care, and it became evident that only by confronting the leader directly, by tracing the organization to its core, could they hope to break free from the psychological grip. But doing so would require courage, resources, and precision that the family and the investigators had never been tested by before, and the days that followed were a blur of planning, surveillance, preparation for a journey into danger, consulting experts in tactical operations, mapping routes, coordinating safe houses, and ensuring that the children could remain protected even as the parents prepared to confront the unknown, and all the while, the circle symbol continued to appear in small, insidious ways, on scraps of paper slipped into bags, in the dust on car windows, and occasionally etched into the ground near their home, a persistent reminder that the adversary was patient, watching and calculating, and as the night before the planned operation approached, The family gathered in the living room, exhausted yet determined. The children huddled together, the parents whispering reassurances, knowing that tomorrow they would step into a confrontation that could finally reveal the leader, the motives, and perhaps the culmination of months of terror, uncertainty, and relentless pursuit finally arrived on a gray, overcast morning, as the family and the investigators prepared to confront the hidden forces behind the children's abduction. A confrontation that would take them to the outskirts of the city, to a compound hidden behind high walls and thick brush, a place the private investigator called the heart of the operation. And as they approached, every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every rustle of leaves carried the weight of anticipation and dread, the children clinging to their parents, sensing the tension and the invisible stakes of what was about to unfold. While the investigators coordinated from vehicles parked at a safe distance, cameras and drones poised to capture every movement, every interaction, knowing that years of planning by those responsible had led to this moment, that the adversary they sought was cunning, patient, and extraordinarily careful, leaving no trace except the faint symbols, the cryptic notes, and the psychological imprint on the children. And when the family finally stepped through a narrow gap in the brush, entering the compound's periphery, the air was heavy with silence, broken only by distant creaking metal doors and the faint hum of generators, and as they moved cautiously toward the main building, they noticed subtle signs. Footprints in the dirt, partially obscured yet telling, a discarded jacket, and finally, inside a darkened room with barred windows and flickering fluorescent lights, the children froze, pointing to a figure standing near a table, cloaked in shadows, whose presence commanded attention, whose very posture radiated control and menace, the leader, the orchestrator of months of fear and manipulation, who finally stepped forward, revealing a face both human and chilling, calm yet imbued with a dangerous intensity, and in that moment, the parents felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of terror, anger, and relief, knowing that after so long, they had located the source of their suffering, and as the leader spoke, his voice low but deliberate, explaining that the children had been moved not out of malice but as part of an elaborate psychological study conducted under the guise of a network whose motives were rooted in secrecy, control, and observation. He described how they had been carefully monitored, guided, and isolated to test resilience, obedience, and response to fear, and though the words were methodical, almost clinical, the parents felt the weight of their children's stolen months, the lost time, the nights of uncertainty, and the emotional scars that would take years to heal, and yet the leader, despite the chilling detachment, allowed the children to speak, and their voices trembled as they described small moments of hope, small acts of defiance, and the silent rebellion that had allowed them to survive, which gave the parents a mixture of pride and heartbreak, recognizing that, while their children were physically unharmed, the psychological landscape had been altered, that they carried memories and impressions that no parent could erase, and the investigators, taking notes, recording the testimony, began piecing together the chain of custody, the travel routes, the safe houses, the symbolic markers, and the notes left for the family, slowly revealing the systematic nature of the operation, the lengths to which the leader had gone to avoid detection, and the meticulous planning that had made tracing the children nearly impossible. Yet as the family spoke with the leader, it became apparent that despite his intelligence, he had underestimated the determination, resourcefulness, and sheer will of the parents and the investigative team, who had navigated months of dead ends, misleading trails, and cryptic signs, and in a carefully orchestrated move, the investigators secured the children, moving them to a safe area while the parents confronted the leader directly, demanding answers, accountability, and the truth about why their lives had been disrupted. And though the leader attempted to justify his actions, citing research, power, or some distorted sense of superiority, the parents' combined presence, grief, and unwavering demand for justice created a tension that forced him to acknowledge that the children's well-being, autonomy, and family ties could not be disregarded any longer. And with the arrival of law enforcement, the leader was detained, his operation dismantled piece by piece, evidence collected, communication networks disabled, and the layers of secrecy peeled away, revealing a network of safe houses, cryptic messages, and methods designed to manipulate and control, which investigators cataloged meticulously to prevent any resurgence. And as the children were reunited with their belongings, their room filled with familiar scents and textures, toys, clothes, and photographs that had been left behind. They began tentative steps toward recovery, laughing nervously at small jokes, holding each other tight, and the parents, though exhausted, allowed themselves a cautious relief, knowing that the immediate danger had ended, yet also aware that emotional healing would be ongoing, therapy, counseling, and patience required for months and years to come, and as the family returned to their home, now under surveillance for protection and with support from law enforcement and investigators, the children gradually began to reclaim routines, school attendance, play, and interaction with peers. Yet moments of fear still surfaced in the night, shadows on walls, unexpected noises, and the lingering sense that the memory of captivity could not be erased, and through counseling, open dialogue, and parental support, they learned to navigate these triggers, understanding that survival had not only physical but deep psychological components, that memory, fear, and resilience were intertwined, and the parents, reflecting on the months of absence, the relentless search, and the months of investigation, realized the value of vigilance, community, and unyielding perseverance, and that though the world had threatened to take their children away, the combination of love, determination, and external support had restored them, not only to life but to themselves, and in the final weeks, the court proceedings took place. The leader and any collaborators brought to justice testimony from investigators, witnesses, and the children themselves, contributing to a record that ensured accountability, punishment, and a measure of closure, and in the aftermath, the family took time to travel together, to reclaim simple pleasures, to be by the water, in parks, hiking trails, enjoying meals together, creating memories free from fear.